So the question today is, when is it too late to start a garden? Of course, this is not a gardening channel, but I do have an answer for you on this because a lot of people who have never gardened before are asking this question and related questions. Is it hard to garden? Can I start this year? Is it worth the time you invest? How do you start a garden? Is it legal to buy seeds? Is it still legal to grow your own food? And these questions are out there because many of us experience the bare shelves in the grocery stores in February and March, and then the food price rises in April and May, and then the news in June and July about the defunded police departments and the statements of truckers. This was really important news, that they will not deliver food in areas lacking basic law and order. And they haven't been. And we've seen backyard gardening exercises and experiments going up this year where there were none before. Now, our family worked to get this backyard garden going early this spring, and the explosive growth that you see around here happened roughly between Mother's Day and Father's Day. Approximately 40 days of sun and rain and biological wonder. It just exploded. And then the vegetables started appearing and then ripening. But here's a quick disclaimer. We are far from knowledgeable gardeners and farmers. We're certainly not full-timers. My wife and I were city kids, and the gardening we've tried has been a mixed experiment. Some success, a lot of disappointment, lots of learning along the way. This year, we had mockingbirds mocking us every day and stealing our strawberries. We've got insects which can kill an entire plant with a few bites to the stem. We've got weeds which can choke everything that we've planted. We've got some crops which attract killer moths, and that was a really interesting thing. We've learned a lot about what to do about that, how to spread out some of those plants with other plants, try to fool the moths. It's really an art and a science to garden, but it's really fun and very rewarding. Now, we're learning a lot now about what to do better in the spring of 2021, and we're getting ready for it now. So back to your question, when is it too late to start a garden? Well, there's something you can always do in a garden and for a garden, all 4 seasons of the year, all the time, even in the dead of winter. You can always be working on your soil. You could be mixing in compost. You can be gathering other organic material to mix with it. And you can do this in the summer even if you don't have a garden booming and growing right now. You can always be getting the rocks out, or most of the rocks. Now, one thing that we have discovered in our garden is that rocks can help you with your growing season. They can hold heat early in the spring. They can hold heat late in the fall. And so we don't get them all out, but we get a lot of them out. And we marvel at how much our early ancestors had to do in this country to clear the fields of rocks, to just do basic farming. That's why we see these magnificent stone fences all over the countryside. So there's always things you can do. You can find and save boards or buckets or fence posts to make life easier next year when you're in all-out warfare against Bambi and Peter Rabbit. You'll need fences. So it's never too late to start a garden unless, and now we've really got to talk about this part, unless you have waited until the food is gone and you'll go hungry before your produce matures and you can eat it. And this almost happened to Britain and France in the 1930s. And here's what's really amazing. This was less than 20 years after times of severe food scarcity in World War I, when food prices rose by 130%. There was severe rationing. There was severe hunger. They failed to learn the valuable lesson that you will starve if you run out of food before your harvest can begin, before you can harvest your gardens. Now, how well do we know this in America? Let's look back for a moment at Britain and France in that twilight year of 1939. Hitler had invaded Poland and was technically at war with Britain and France, but French and British citizens were not taking the situation seriously. Author William Manchester remembered that Churchill despaired at the complacency everywhere. Visitors to the French front were often struck by the prevailing atmosphere of calm aloofness, by the seemingly poor quality of the work that was going on to try to keep the Germans out of their country, by the lack of visible activity of any kind. And the British military were no better. The citizenry as a whole coasted along in what Churchill called a twilight mood. The Germans were using the lull in the action to gear up for full-on war. The public continued to live in a state of unreality. Their minds turned to the same distractions and trivialities that had diverted their attention in peace. Writes Manchester, quote, 9 months after the outbreak, English life had returned to normal. Idle men dozed on Hyde Park deck chairs. The sheep lazed away in the days in London's park enclosures, and admiring crowds gathered by nearby duck ponds. So America is not now technically at world war, but our local economies are as weak as Britain's were when vast numbers of the young men had to quit work, join the military, and die in battle. Economist Dr. Gary North says this, quote, when people are unemployed, resources are unemployed. When labor, capital, and raw materials are not being used to produce goods, we call it a recession. And that's where we are today. That's where we are going to be in July, August, and September of 2021, he says, by making predictions based on the data that he's looking at. End quote. Now, Britain and France could have been and should have been much better prepared, and we can learn from their apathy. Once fighting began in earnest, food shortages were severe, especially in Britain. Even the children evacuated from the cities were not getting enough food in the country. And why is that? Britain was simply not ready. They had this phenomenally beautiful, productive soil, but the young farmers were off to war. Families tried to do what they could by starting little victory gardens wherever there was soil, anywhere there was soil. But it was really a little bit too little and too late. Would it be enough? And it really wasn't enough. President Roosevelt sent a somewhat secret delegation of American farmers to Britain to see if they could advise that nation on more productive gardening and farming. My grandfather was one of the experts selected for the mission. In this photograph here, he meets British orphans getting a wartime meal. Their parents had been killed in bombings, and the nation is trying to protect them and help them, keep them alive for the future. Fewer adults who could garden and farm now were available. Not only were the young men off at war, many of the older were being killed and slaughtered by the bombings. So kids had to learn to farm the soil too. And like my grandfather did himself at age 8 when his own father went mostly blind, my grandfather at that point became a full-time farmer. And then in Britain, he contributed what he could to British food security, learning from the experience that it is really hard to catch up on food availability when soil is not prepared on time. Planting is not done on time because the growing season simply does not wait. And farming simply cannot happen when farm boys are overseas waiting to be strafed by German planes on French beaches. And so unprepared Britain and unprepared France had to turn to the importation of food from North America. They pulled in more than 20 million tons per year, and they would have starved without it. And to get this food, they had to pay for it. They transferred the wealth of their nations primarily to the Americans who had productive farms and gardens. Conditions of war are not the only hard times the farming industry faces. Lockdowns and inflation also can destroy agriculture. And early 2020 saw American farmers stuck with livestock and produce that they couldn't move because of slaughterhouse shutdowns, transportation problems, and other marketing crises. Some crops had to be plowed under. And I had reports from men who were seeing this along the highways, the farmers just simply plowing their crops under. Food scarcity is now showing up in the market. You know that, and I know that. Prices are rising. Lines are still long at food banks. In one photograph I saw in our previous hometown, 10,000 cars long. So what will the food supplies be like in the coming winter? We're just not sure yet. If the economy remains unproductive and crime keeps rising and the value of currency keeps falling, our lives will change. The center of my universe, the center of your universe is shifting to our kitchens and our backyards and our neighborhoods and our communities. Now, this does not have to be a defeatist sort of retreat. It can be the very best thing that ever happened to us. We have this unique opportunity now to turn our localities into engines of free market contracting and productivity and prosperity and peace, justice, hope, and localized law and order. That is a really important opportunity that we have now. So if we're to learn anything from Britain and France, we need to be making our soil as productive as possible. And even if you're not growing your gardens, you could be getting your soil ready, your garden beds ready for a time that may be a whole lot worse than right now this summer. Yes, that could very possibly happen. And this would be a step of responsibility you would be taking. And if you can encourage your neighbors and others in your community to do that too, that would be a really wise move on your part. A good place to begin productivity is where you have influence, and please do enlarge your influence. It's time to stand up and lead. In your neighborhood, get out there and try to help people. If you don't have a garden, other people do. See if you can help them with their gardens. There are always weeds to pull. There are things that you could do to help them. Our nearest neighbor saw our garden in the spring and started this one of her own. And we compare notes on what we're learning. So starting a garden can open up a new level of friendships, as well as a new level of thinking and evaluating, planning, networking, studying, and helping neighbors. We'll be learning new things about agriculture in general that we didn't know, like why our founders held it in such high esteem as a cultural way of life. They loved the agrarian way of life and advocated it for our nation. Thomas Jefferson, I'll close with this quote, believed that agriculture is our wisest pursuit because it will in the end contribute most to real wealth, good morals, and happiness.